welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph.
Hello, everyone.
Now, normally this is where we're going to dig into history, but today we're talking about something unfolding right now, something that will become history in the making.
And we're just getting ahead of it. It's like still history, just not yet.
It's history in the making.
Right.
So, late last night, the United States carried out a series of airstrikes on Iran, Operation Midnight Hammer, targeting 3 of its nuclear facilities, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. These were coordinated precision strikes involving B-2 bombers and submarine-launched Tomahawk missiles. According to official statements, the facilities were completely and totally obliterated. This is the first time the U.S. has struck targets on Iranian soil since 1979. President Trump announced the operation early this morning, calling it a decisive move to neutralize the threat and send a message. Iran's government, on the other hand, is calling the strikes illegal, and they're promising to respond. So, what actually happened? Why and what role did the U.S. naval power play in making this mission possible? So, over this episode, we're going to talk through the operation using only confirmed official sources. Sources like the White House, the Pentagon, international monitoring agencies, and allied governments. And we're leaving the speculation out to Fox News.
Well, there's a lot of speculation on many sides.
So let's grab a coffee if you want. You might actually need a beer or even whiskey for this, but let's take a closer look at this, shall we?
And yeah? Sorry, I thought you were talking to the audience, but maybe you're talking to me through the audience, or the audience through me. I'll say yes.
That's the whole reason you're here.
Yeah, that's right. The audience says yes.
All right, let's get underway. So we're going to try to break this down as full of detail as we're going to be able to. We're going to walk through the what, the where, the how of last night's strike on the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. The operation began in the early morning hours of June 21st, around 0200 local time in Iran. The United States launched simultaneous precision airstrikes against 3 targets: the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, the Natanz nuclear facility, and the industrial compound near Isfahan. All of these sites are central to Iran's uranium enrichment program. So let's go into platforms and payloads. This was a joint force operation, primarily led by U.S. Strategic Command in coordination with the U.S. Central Command and U.S. European Command. According to the Pentagon, the strike package included 3 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers from Whitman Air Force Base, which were reportedly forward deployed to a classified location in the Middle East earlier this month. They were a diversion. 7 B-2 bombers left the U.S. for the strike and were refueled mid-flight. They used very minimum communications. Now, these bombers were each equipped with 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators. They're 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs specifically designed for hardened underground targets.
Yeah.
Additional air support included EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare and F-22 Raptors providing air dominance cover in case of Iranian retaliation. At sea, we have Ohio-class guided missile submarines. Most likely, one of them was the USS Florida, SSGN 728. And they fired over 24 Tomahawk block cruise missiles towards Natanz, and Isfahan. Airborne refueling and ISR support, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, was provided by KC-135 Stratotankers, RC-135 Rivet Joint, and E-8C J-Star platforms. There has also been confirmation from an official Department of Defense statement that the strike was rehearsed multiple times in simulation before the go-ahead. A notable tactic involved the deployment of decoy B-2s flying from a separate base, which is what I mentioned before, in Europe to trigger and saturate Iranian air defense tracking. This misdirection created a brief but critical opening for the real strike aircraft to fly low and fast under radar coverage, minimizing risk and exposure to Iran's Russian-supplied S-300 air defense systems, particularly those stationed around Isfahan and the nuclear site at Natanz. The result, according to satellite imagery released this morning and verified by the IAEA, significant structural damage was inflicted on all three targets. Here's a bit of a rundown. At Fordow, the most deeply buried of all of the three sites, was built into a mountain near Qom, and it appears to have suffered a complete collapse of its primary enrichment chamber. While the exact depth of the damage isn't yet public, early reports suggest that both cascade halls were rendered inoperable.
Ooh.
At Natanz, they had already been targeted by sabotage and cyber attacks in the recent years. They took a direct hit to its centrifuge assembly building and what analysts believe was a newly completed underground tunnel network. Multiple cruise missile impacts confirmed. At Isfahan, they were hit with both airdrop ordnance and tomahawks. It included a heavy water production facility at what may have been a covert centrifuge component plant. We don't know much more about that. Details are still developing. Now, here's what's critical. The IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, confirmed that there are no radiation leaks being detected at any of the sites. So there is no indication so far of a nuclear and radiological release.
That's very good.
Yes. The White House, in a formal statement released, described the strikes as limited, focused, and successful. President Trump's wording was a bit more dramatic, calling it a, quote, spectacular success. He also claimed that the targets were completely and totally obliterated. Now, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth followed up with a press briefing this morning at the Pentagon, emphasizing that the operation was designed to avoid civilian casualties and neutralize Iran's near-term nuclear breakout capability. So from a strategic standpoint, this strike represents a major escalation, not just tactically, but politically and diplomatically. This is the first time since the Iranian Revolution in 1979 that U.S. forces have conducted kinetic operations directly on Iranian territory. Until now, even the most aggressive U.S. actions, whether under Bush, Obama, or Biden, stopped short of striking inside the country itself. We've seen cyber attacks, sabotage via Mossad, drone strikes against proxies, and sanctions, but nothing like this. Notably, this was not a warning shot. This was a deliberate and surgical effort to dismantle nuclear infrastructure using overwhelming force and precision timing. We should also point out that this wasn't a standalone Navy operation.
Oh, no.
But naval assets played a key enabling role. Submarine-launched cruise missiles, ISR support from carrier strike group satellites, and secure comms relay from naval relay aircraft were all part of the strike ecosystem. This was a textbook example of multi-domain operations, integrating air, sea, space, and cyber in one coordinated blow.
That's really, I'm sorry to interrupt. That
No.
takes in an immense amount of coordination. That's to get all those different domains working in a combined effort is very, I mean, even in one, like to have what, just a Navy approach execute successfully without issue can be a job, and there are people that are capable and can do it. But to do that and communicate across all these different branches and then work together, that's really speaks well of our military's ability to cooperate, which isn't always the case in a lot of, even in our military or militaries across the world.
That the U.S. military has proven time and time again is our willingness and commitment for inter-service communication, inter-service cooperation.
Cooperation?
So, what does this mean on the ground right now? According to the Iranian Foreign Ministry, they're calling the strike a flagrant violation of international law and are vowing to respond at a time and place of their choosing. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, has placed ballistic missile units on alert. The Hezbollah has reportedly begun mobilizing assets in southern Lebanon. That's unconfirmed at the time of this recording, but multiple governments in the region are heightening security. The U.S. has already repositioned Aegis-equipped destroyers into the Persian Gulf and is deploying Patriot missile batteries in several Gulf states. In short, the military is preparing for the possibility of follow-on retaliation. So to wrap up this first part, what we witnessed last night was the execution of a deliberate, high-level, high-risk military operation with precision coordination across air and naval assets. The stated goal, according to the White House and Pentagon, was to deny Iran the ability to rapidly enrich weapons-grade uranium and to send a clear message that nuclear brinkmanship has limits. So, anything to say before we move on?
Yeah, I think the big question I have, and you know, I draw my own conclusions, but I think it's a question everybody should ask as a global citizen: what constitutes the ability to either have a nuclear weapon or prevent someone else from having a nuclear weapon? And I guess you could also just scale it to any level of weaponry, right? Like who can have battleships, submarines, guns? You know what I mean? And why should one have one and another not? And I can see why everybody would want one. But as a global society, like all these countries that are preventing Iran from doing so, why are they doing that? And I think exploring that question is vital.
Okay. Well, I don't agree that it can pertain to all weapons.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
This is weapons of mass destruction.
Well, I think, yes. So weapons of mass destruction in one attack can lead to devastating consequences. But if you look at a 9/11, for example, that had technically no weapons, right? So what is it that we're... I think it's more of who has power to execute different attacks, and what is the responsibility of everyone to keep that in line, or is there one? Or is it completely hands-off and isolationist, like, hey, you know what, that's not our business?
So, you want to know the rationale behind
Well,
this.
not that I want to know. I just think it's important that it's a discussion, right, that needs to be had. Everybody, like, to say, oh, that's wrong, or yeah, that's right. Well, why? Like, make sure you're not just being reactive, but that you're thinking through what's driving you to this conclusion. What are you thinking that is supporting this effort? You know what I mean? And so, like you said, this is a historical event. And we have yet to see what's going to unfold, but we can look back and say, well, what led to this and why? One of the questions you said at the beginning was, why now?
Let's get into why now.
Okay,
then.
let's do that then.
Let's dig into why would the United States authorize a strike of this magnitude against hardened targets on Iranian soil at this particular moment. So to answer that, we need to unpack three things: strategic timing, geopolitical pressure, and the collapse of the nuclear diplomacy track. So let's start with timing.
Okay.
According to officials of the White House and the Department of Defense, planning for this operation accelerated over the past 2 weeks after U.S. intelligence confirmed that Iran had begun enriching uranium to near weapons grade levels. That's above 90% purity, the technical threshold for a nuclear weapon. Now, technically, Iran has never acknowledged going that far, but U.S. satellite and signal intelligence apparently caught centrifuges cascading running in that range. The IAEA inspectors were recently barred from certain sites, which further raised alarms. Add to the fact that Israel has been carrying out its own strikes across Iran since June 13th, including a massive airstrike in Shiraz targeting IRGC weapons depots, and you have a rapidly escalating regional situation. The U.S. has reportedly been coordinating intelligence with the Israeli Defense Forces, and as of last week, American officials publicly warned Iran that retaliation against Israel would result in consequences. So some analysts are viewing this U.S. strike as a deterrent message, not just about nukes, but about regional aggression.
Well, regional aggression, I mean, so as I'm an older guy, not that old, but just to give you an idea, I would watch Nick at Night in the late 80s, and they would show older, like the original episodes of Saturday Night Live. And so Saturday Night Live has always had a news segment, quote unquote, and they would talk about trouble in the Middle East. And it's like, yep.
Oh, yeah.
It's been going on a while.
Yes, it has. It's been going on for a very, very long time. So let's talk about the collapse of diplomacy. So up until late May, there were quiet background efforts or back channel efforts between U.S. and Iranian negotiators, reportedly through Oman and Qatar, aimed at rebooting the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. But these talks fell apart when Iran refused to grant full access to its underground sites and continued to work on advanced centrifuges, like the IR-6 and IR-8 models, which can enrich uranium at 3 to 5 times the speed of older designs. When the IAEA publicly censured Iran on June 15th for stonewalling inspections and accelerating enrichment, the U.S. interpreted it as a clear sign that diplomacy had hit a wall. According to NSC officials in their background briefing, the administration decided that continued inaction could result in Iran achieving breakout capability, which means it's the ability to produce a nuclear weapon on short notice, which is between 3 and 4 weeks. That's a red line.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
It is also worth noting that this isn't just about nuclear physics. It's about political pressure at home and abroad. Now, domestically, President Trump has been under intense scrutiny following a string of foreign policy crises. And polling showed declining public confidence in national security leadership. A bold military move, especially one framed as preemptive and successful, can shift that narrative quickly. And historically, presidents have often used military action to reassert executive authority and rally political capital. We saw it with Clinton in Kosovo,
Yep.
Bush in Iraq, and Obama in Libya. Internationally, the administration likely calculated that its allies would support a limited, non-occupational strike, especially given the growing perception that Iran was operating with impunity. And so far, that seems to be playing out. The UK, France, and Germany have issued statements of cautious support, noting that while they still favor diplomacy, they understand the need to prevent proliferation. So let's move on to strategy. The Pentagon has framed this as a, quote, deterrence reset. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth used that phrase directly in his briefing. He said, quote, "The calculus in Tehran has shifted. We are no longer in an era where red lines can be crossed without consequences." The strike's design reflects that. The U.S. avoided hitting population centers, regime leadership, or military bases. This wasn't about decapitation. It was about precision, targeting the nuclear program only and making it clear that the U.S. is capable and willing to act unilaterally when international mechanisms fail. Now, of course, this strategy is not without risk. Iran has multiple response options, from asymmetric proxy attacks to missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq, Syria, or even the Gulf. And while the U.S. has moved carrier groups into the region and elevated alert levels at the air bases, there's always the danger of miscalculation, of tit-for-tat escalation that pulls multiple actors into a broader war. There's also the question of legal authority. While the White House did not notify congressional leadership under the War Powers Act, many lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are questioning whether this strike constituted a legitimate act of national self-defense or whether it should have required a full congressional authorization for use of force. And we'll get into that here soon, but the bottom line for now, this was a strike born out of intelligence urgency, diplomatic breakdown, and a deliberate choice by the U.S. to restore deterrence after years of raising Iranian confidence. It's a reminder that even in the modern era, when cyber operations and proxy conflicts tend to dominate the headlines, sometimes history turns on the roar of afterburners and the shockwave of 30,000 pounds of steel hitting rock.
I think that's a good overview of the things that need to be discussed or what's being talked about. We'll probably get into it later, but I just think about all the proxies that Iran uses and the trouble that they incite as a result and how that helps deflect direct criticism by a lot of folks. All I keep thinking about are the Houthi rebels in Yemen that are mucking around with the Straits of Hormuz. Mm-hmm. And so that's been a problem for a while, and all that is backed by Iran. And it isn't Yemen that's causing the problem, it's Iran. So what do you do with that? How do you combat a nation that's funding paramilitary groups abroad to cause trouble for many? So we can get into that later, but it's just, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
All right. So the bombs have dropped, the satellites have recorded the damage, and the headlines are everywhere. The question now is, how are world leaders responding? So let's start at home. Within minutes of the first explosions, the White House released a prepared statement. President Trump called the strike a spectacular success. and reiterated that the operation was designed to, quote, neutralize an imminent threat posed by Iran's nuclear program. He emphasized that the U.S. would not seek regime change, but warned that any retaliation would be met with what he called overwhelming force. Vice President J.D. Vance echoed these statements in a separate press appearance, describing the strikes as surgical, lawful, and long overdue. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who was flanked by senior Joint Chiefs officials at the Pentagon, briefed reporters this morning. He confirmed that no U.S. personnel were injured, all aircraft returned safely, and that the operation had, quote, achieved all stated objectives. He was very careful to describe the strike as limited in scope, signaling a desire to avoid broader escalation. And now, meanwhile, Secretary of State Mark Rubio reached out to NATO and Gulf Cooperation Council allies to brief them on the operation. He also held a call with the UN Secretary General to reinforce the U.S. position that the strike was defensive, proportionate, and justified under Article 51 of the UN Charter. That's the clause that permits self-defense in the face of a credible threat. Now, here's where things get interesting. The congressional response has been split, not along traditional partisan lines, but more so between hawks and restrainers. So let's move on to Capitol Hill. Senator Tom Cotton called the strike, quote, a bold reassertion of American deterrence, and praised the president for acting decisively. Other Republicans, including Senators Lindsey Graham and Mark Rubio, lined up in support. But on the other side of the aisle, some prominent Democrats and even a few Republicans are pushing back. Representative Ko Kahana issued a strongly worded statement saying, quote, this was an unauthorized act of war against a sovereign nation. The Constitution is clear. Congress declares war, not the president. Representative Alexandra Cortez called for immediate hearings, while Senator Rand Paul warned of unintended consequences and described the strike as strategic overreach. The War Powers Resolution was invoked by multiple lawmakers this morning, demanding that the administration provide a full rationale and scope of operations within 48 hours. So while the Pentagon is painting this as a clean operation, the political battle in Washington is heating up.
So the viewers may have felt it but not seen it, but there was a period where I just put my hand over my eyes. I was like, yeah, boy. Yep. Just for everybody's knowledge, I remember when Operation Desert Storm took place, the first Iraq War.
So do I.
So, yeah. So what's interesting about that is there was never a declaration of war there. And then I thought that was interesting because I'm learning all this stuff in school, like what the separation of powers are, who has the ability to declare war and approve treaties and all this stuff. And I'm like, we're doing all this stuff and we never declared war. What's up with that? And so there was an authorization for the use of military force, joint resolution, which is like, yeah, we kind of think it's okay for you to do this, but there was never technically a declaration of war. And then when I go back, so like Obama in Syria or our participation in UN efforts in the Balkans, like Croatia, Kosovo during the Clinton administration, Korea, Vietnam, none of those had a declaration of war.
Nope.
We haven't declared war since World War II.
That is correct.
And so, like, this isn't new, I guess. And I'm not
in the least.
I'm not saying that it is okay, but the surprise that lawmakers have in this, I'm like, well, we've been doing this for a while. Maybe say, hey, we've been doing this for a while and we shouldn't be doing that. But to say, oh, you need to do, well, we're not declaring war. We're using kinetic action, right? Military force on a strategic thing. We're not trying to take over Tehran. I can see if we're declaring war on Iran and doing that, Yeah, but I mean, we took over Baghdad, and we didn't even declare war then. So, what are we doing?
Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the reason why we haven't declared war in any of these conflicts is because of the UN.
I expand on that.
There are certain provisions in the UN Charter and all that everybody's agreed to, that there are specific ways and reasons why a war can be declared.
All right.
And so the way the U.S. has gotten around that is by not declaring war, and by declaring peace actions or police actions or whatever their justification is.
Mm-hmm.
So that is why a war has never officially been declared since World War II.
That's weird because when I hear, "Oh, this is illegal," like I'm for, let me just put this on record. I am for the Geneva Convention. Let's start there. But when I hear, "Yeah, you can't do that. That's illegal." I'm like, "Well, war doesn't follow rules necessarily. If you want to declare war on somebody, you can do that." And I don't know what the enforcing body of the UN that would prevent you from doing that. Like, what are the consequences? Like, let's say the United States wants to declare war right now. What would the UN do to stop them? Or how would they respond?
If it's not a legal declaration of war as defined by the United Nations, I don't know specifically what the quote unquote punishments to the U.S. would be,
Mm-hmm.
but they'd probably be doing something like restrictions in trade, things of that nature. Just try to use whatever influence they had. I mean, militarily, they're not going to be able to do anything.
Right.
But there's different things that the treaties that have been signed and all that they would enforce on. And
So let me ask this. Has that happened with Russia, with Ukraine from the UN specifically?
I mean, lots of restrictions have been placed on Russia.
But was that a UN thing, or were those just like the G8? Oh, as we're going to get together as the top economic countries and have sanctions against you.
I'm sure that the UN has had influence in those decisions as well. I mean, the UN has had a lead role in building up forces across the UN member countries along the Russian border.
So that always confuses me because I know on the Security Council there are 5 permanent members and then some rotating temporary members. But of the 5 permanent members, you've got Russia as one of them and the United States as one of them. And so if there's any UN resolution that says, hey, we want to put sanctions on you for declaring war and you shouldn't have done that, they can just say, yeah, we're going to veto that. And then it doesn't happen. They have a little bit more wiggle room, I guess, from that perspective. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding the way the Security Council works, but that's how it was taught to me in high school.
There also might be a clause in there that if the main belligerent is part of that council, they will not be allowed to cast a vote.
Ooh, here's some homework for the listener. Because yes, we could do it, but that would really reduce the interaction we have with the listeners. So hey, listeners, why don't you look up what consequences exist for a belligerent who currently is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and those people include the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK. So if any of them are a belligerent, what happens?
Yeah, there we go. Let smarter people than us figure that out.
Yes, that's how you succeed.
All right, so let's shift gears. Let's go to the Iran's response.
Yeah.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has officially condemned the strikes as a, quote, grave violation of international law and a direct act of aggression. In a televised address, Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi declared a state of mourning and promised a decisive and regrettable response. Iran's foreign ministry summoned the Swiss ambassador who represents U.S. interests in Tehran, since we have no official embassy, to deliver a formal protest. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued its own statement saying, quote, America has crossed a red line. Our enemies will taste the bitterness of their crime. The time and place of our response will be on our terms. Now, we've already seen indications that the IRGC cruise and drone units have been placed on alert, particularly in western Iran and in Syria, where Iranian forces maintain forward positions. Iranian state TV also reported a partial mobilization of Basji volunteer forces, although this has not been confirmed by independent sources. One thing to note, despite their fiery rhetoric, Iran has not launched a retaliatory strike yet. This doesn't mean they won't, but it suggests that they may be weighing options, possibly asymmetric or proxy-based responses rather than direct attacks on U.S. forces. All right, so let's move on to the regional picture. Israel has praised the U.S. strike as a, quote, historic stand against nuclear blackmail. Prime Minister Benny Gantz said, quote, the U.S. has reaffirmed the red line. The United States has reaffirmed the red lines that ensure regional security. Israel will continue to act to defend itself with or without partners. Israeli forces remain on high alert with Iron Dome batteries deployed on the north and near the Gaza border, anticipating possible rocket attacks from Hezbollah or Iranian-backed militias. Now, Lebanon's Hezbollah, for its part, released a statement condemning the strike and warned that, quote, resistance will not go unanswered. In South Lebanon, some border skirmishers have already been reported, but nothing major as of right now, as of this recording. In Iraq and Syria, both the Popular Mobilization Forces and pro-Iranian militias have declared readiness to act. U.S. air bases have increased security measures with overhead drone surveillance and anti-rocket systems fully activated. The Houthis in Yemen also released a statement of solidarity with Iran, calling the U.S. strike, quote, a provocation against all free peoples of the region. No attacks from them yet, but as we've seen in the past, they're capable of launching missiles and drones at Saudi or Emirate targets. So globally, the United Nations held an emergency closed-door Security Council session early this morning. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a statement saying he is, quote, gravely concerned and urged all parties to avoid further escalation. NATO Security General Jens Stoltenberg said the alliance had been briefed in advance and expressed, quote, support for the defense of allied interests, but called for restraint. The UK and Australia have backed the operation in principle, citing Iran's growing threat to non-proliferation norms, while Germany and France issued more cautious statements, supporting deterrence but warning that diplomacy must remain on the table. China and Russia, predictably, condemned the U.S. action. Moscow called it a, quote, irresponsible act of aggression, while Beijing warned...
Sorry. Okay. I could not hold my incredulity in while you were speaking. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Beijing warned of global consequences and called for an immediate return to negotiations. So this is a stark reminder that while the strike may have accomplished its military objective, the diplomatic ripples are still spreading. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that the United States successfully executed a high-precision strike with international support from some corners and harsh commendation from others.
Well, hold on, wait a minute. So, yes, Iran for sure said, hey, this is bad, because they should, right? The opponents that you said submitted these statements, they were all militias or groups. Like when you said militias in Iraq or Syria or Yemen or even Lebanon, I'm like, so of those countries, of Syria, Iraq, Yemen, even Saudi Arabia, like all the neighbors there, what do they think? Like officially, are they? And of course, there's going to be a lot of diplomacy, like some face saving stuff, because you don't want to necessarily go all in and say we 100% support this or we 100% don't support this. But there might be like, hey, maybe that wasn't so good. You should really think about it. Let's cool off. Let's come together. Let's work it out. But secretly, you could be like, yes, I'm so glad that happened, or no, I can't believe that happened. What?
Well,
Go ahead.
remember, this happened less than 24 hours.
Oh, yeah.
So countries are still reacting. Countries are still getting their thoughts together. So we'll see more statements from more people, more
I'm sure.
countries
But this was a lead up.
later.
Like when you say why now, the IAEA was like, hey, they're getting close and they're keeping us out. And this is an indication. I think that was like either earlier this year or maybe late last year. They were starting to say this. And Iran has neighbors, right? And so the neighbors, they had a prolonged war with Iraq for a while, and I guess that was under Saddam Hussein, so I don't know what the dynamics are now, but I know for sure Saudi Arabia and Iran are at odds. And so, yes, they could be launching hypersonic missiles into Israel, Iran is, but I mean, if there's a nuclear weapon-enabled Iran, what do the neighbors think of that?
Well, you also got to remember the topography of what Iran is. It is surrounded by mountains.
Mm.
So it is very, very defensible.
Yeah.
So that has helped keep them so safe from their neighbors.
Yeah, I really have a lot more respect for Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia, given that. But I mean, it's way off topic. But yeah, you're right. It's very defensible as a result.
All right. So is obviously angry.
Oh, yeah.
But
I would be too.
Right now, they're being cautious. Allies are nervous, and adversaries are watching very, very carefully. This is a critical inflection point, not for just U.S. and Iran relations, but for the entire architecture of the security in the Middle East. The question is no longer if there will be a response, but how and when. So let's step back now, not from the facts, but from the flashpoints. So let's talk about the bigger picture.
All right.
Because while the strike on Iran's nuclear facilities is dominating headlines right now, what matters most over the coming weeks is how this changes the strategic landscape in the Middle East and beyond. So let's begin with the Navy's role.
Yeah. First and foremost, obviously.
Yes. While this wasn't a maritime strike in the traditional sense, the U.S. Navy was central to enabling the mission. Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from guided missile submarines, likely operating in the Arabian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman. While names haven't been officially released, analysts believe the USS Florida, SSGN 728, and the USS Georgia, SSGN 729, were forward deployed in the region as part of Task Force 54. Carrier Strike Group 9, centered around the USS John C. Stennis, CVN 74, was repositioned to 5th Fleet's area of responsibility about 72 hours before the strike, providing a ready response air wing, ISR coverage, and anti-air and missile defense. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the U.S. isn't just reacting, it's preparing for second and third order effects. The Navy has now shifted to a power projection and force protection posture. That includes Aegis-equipped destroyers like the USS McFowle, DDG-74, and the USS Laboon, DDG-58, positioned near checkpoints like the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. Carrier-based aircraft flying combat air patrols near Kuwait, Bahrain, and the Gulf of Aden, and also maritime patrol assets such as the P-8A Poseidons, conducting under-siege surveillance for potential IRGC naval activity. These moves signal a very clear message. The U.S. intends to contain escalation without appearing vulnerable. Now, here's where it gets more complicated.
Yeah, more complicated than we are now. But yes, continue.
Yes. Last night's operation may go down as the most significant shift in U.S. deterrence policy since the post 9/11 strikes in Afghanistan. Since 1979, Iran has operated on the assumption that its homeland was off limits, that U.S. responses would remain limited to economic pressure, cyber warfare, or attacks on proxies. That assumption just evaporated.
Yeah.
In a single night, the U.S. changed the rules of engagement. And not just for Iran, but for all nuclear threshold states. And arguably for near-peer advisories like China and Russia, watching closely from the sidelines. The logic is clear. If you're building a bomb and you're nearing breakout capability and diplomacy fails, you are now a legitimate military target, no matter how deep underground your facilities are. But this creates new strategic challenges too. Because if Iran feels it has nothing left to lose, it may move faster towards weaponization or encourage its proxies to escalate the conflict regionally. And if the U.S. is now seen as willing to strike first based on intelligence assessments of nuclear capability, other nations might accelerate their own programs in secret or disperse facilities even more widely. That's the double edge of preemptive deterrence. It can prevent a bomb today, but incentivize one tomorrow.
Yeah, I think the stakes are pretty high with a nuclear weapon, because I keep thinking as everything you said was right, but it's like, well, we did that with Syria, right? We were launching strikes in Syria, in their homeland, and it was physical attacks, right? So this isn't new for America. And again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong in this circumstance, but it's not new. We've been doing this kind of stuff. Again, the Yugoslav conflict, I guess Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Serbs, yeah, that happened, like almost 30 years ago. So at what point do you say, well, yeah, we probably should prevent them from, like that was the whole motivation for going into Iraq, even though that's been disproven, I guess. Everybody says, oh yeah, we never found weapons of mass destruction. But if we did, I think everybody would have been on board with going into Iraq, because that was the whole motivation for doing so. So if Iran, who is purporting, hey, we say death to America often, and we're pursuing a nuclear weapon, is that something that's okay?
It is now. Apparently, it is now.
Well, I mean, it happened now. But is it okay?
Remember, for these other conflicts, there was more support for them before going in. This was a complete and utter surprise.
Mm-hmm.
There was no support for this, at least not publicly.
Yeah, not publicly, and it's such a tenuous situation.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah,
and that is a game changer.
Yeah.
So I think that's what the biggest difference is between those and this is.
I could see that, yeah.
All right, so let's look at the regional dominoes. The most immediate concern is retaliation by Iran, directly or through its axis of resistance. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, or the Syrian regime's IRGC allied units. Already, U.S. bases have gone into threat condition Delta, which is the highest readiness level short of active combat.
Wow.
In Bahrain, the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters has implemented full perimeter lockdown, and drone and ballistic missile defenses are on standby. Israel is preparing for cross-border skirmishes with Hezbollah and has repositioned troops near the Golan Heights. Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE have all issued emergency alerts for diplomatic facilities and U.S. personnel. But it's not just the Middle East. In Europe, NATO is reassessing its missile defense coverage. In southern and eastern member states, are worried about a wider Iranian missile range or retaliatory cyber attacks against allies. In Asia, both India and Pakistan, near nuclear states themselves, have issued statements reinforcing the importance of non-proliferation while avoiding taking sides. But intelligence analysts warn that this kind of strike could embolden hardliners in South Asia to consider preemptive doctrines of their own. Bottom line, the region is more tense today than at any point since the Gulf War. And escalation isn't just possible, it's likely in some form.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, some would say this is an ultimate response from an Israeli perspective of the October 7th attacks that they experienced via an Iranian proxy. And so a lot of stuff has happened since then that they've been systematically working their way this way. Like before America dropped these bombs, the bunker busters specifically, like Israel was projecting air superiority all over Iran, and they were taking down missile sites, and they were like actively engaging in destroying their military capacity. Before that, they had, what was that beeper attack? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah. With all the beepers after being brought into the country and sold to the public, a signal went out and they all detonated at once.
Right. And so they're systematically taking out the leadership of those that they see as what caused that. And so whether it's Hezbollah or ultimately Iran, who's funding all that stuff, I mean, we see, so maybe like this is the blowback from that. And I'm sure, yeah, there's also stuff that happened before that, right? It's important to have context, but how far back do you go? Or what was the point of origination? Or when do you stop? Or at what point do you call, hey, guys, let's get together and have peace? Or what are the prerequisites for that? So I think those are all important to think about.
Well, the prerequisite for peace is not hating each other.
Well, no, you can hate your neighbor. You know what I mean? But it doesn't mean I'm going to wreck his stuff. In fact, true story, we had a neighbor that did not like us very much at all, mostly because we had a weak fence and our dog kept getting into their yard. We did fix the fence. So, yeah, he was right. Fix the fence, no problem. But even still, he knocked on our door and said, hey, you left your lights on in your car. And he didn't like us, but he wasn't going to be the kind of neighbor that was going to be actively destructive. You know what I mean? You don't need to like your neighbor, but be a neighbor.
Yeah. He's just plotting when he's going to release his ICBM into your roof.
Yeah. Like if he was talking to the neighbors about how he's going to do everything in his power to get us to move out of the neighborhood, I'd be like, hey, what's with all this publicly decrying our family? Well, you know how it is. We don't like you. Oh, okay, well, we can still be neighbors. Like, we still have to share the same space. I don't know. We'll see where this goes. Like you said, this is just kind of a history-making event, a policy-shifting paradigm.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm very curious to see where this goes.
All right, so let's move on. So, who was this strike really for? Yes, it's targeted Iran's nuclear infrastructure, but it also sent a message to adversaries, allies, and to the American public. To Iran, it said, we're done talking. Your enrichment process will not go unchecked. To Israel, it said, you're not alone. We're in this fight for now. To Russia and China, it said, the U.S. still acts decisively when vital interests are at stake. And to the American public, it said, we're not letting another nuclear state emerge on our watch. Whether that message is effective or backfires depends entirely on what happens next. So, to wrap up this whole section, the U.S. strike on nuclear facilities wasn't just a tactical action. It was a geopolitical reset with consequences for nuclear deterrence, regional power dynamics, and the future of military doctrine in the age of great power competition. For the Navy, This moment affirms its role not just as a projection of force, but as a pillar of strategic containment. Submarines, destroyers, carrier groups, they're not just floating platforms, they're forward positioned chess pieces in an increasingly crowded and unpredictable board. And while the missiles have stopped flying, for now, the real test of strategy, discipline, and diplomacy is just beginning. So, we've covered what happened, why it happened, and how the world has responded, at least up until this second. So this brings us to the most important and frankly the most unanswered question of all. What happens next?
Yeah.
Because while last night's strike was tactically successful, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new phase in the U.S.-Iran relationship and possibly a turning point for the entire region. So let's break this down across 4 domains: military, diplomatic, cyber/asymmetric, and domestic political. First, let's talk military risk. The most immediate concern for CENTCOM planners is direct or proxy retaliation. According to Pentagon officials, U.S. forces in the region have been placed on heightened alert across all major bases. In terms of assets, Carrier Strike Group 9 is conducting 24-hour flight ops in the northern Arabian Sea. And Patriot missile batteries are being repositioned in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Amphibious ready groups have begun repositioning near the Red Sea, likely as a contingency evacuation support for embassies or NGOs if hostilities escalate. There are 3 main retaliation vectors analysts are watching. 1. Direct ballistic or cruise missile strikes on U.S. bases, particularly in Iraq or Syria. Iran has done this before, like in the 2020 Al-Asad airbase attack for the killing of Qasim Soleimani. 2. Attacks by proxy militias such as the Kataib Hezbollah or Asib al-Haq in Iraq, or the Houthis in Yemen, launching drones or missiles at U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. 3. Naval aggression in the Strait of Hormuz, including harassment of commercial shipping or mine-laying activity. That is where the Navy's presence is most critical. Iran's calculations will be this: respond enough to show resolve, but not so much that it invites a second wave of U.S. air power. So, diplomatic. On the diplomatic side, things are moving quickly. As of this morning, emergency sessions of both the UN Security Council and IAEA Board of Governors has been scheduled. The U.S. has already briefed NATO and several Arab allies. The Secretary of State Rubio is coordinating a diplomatic stabilization coalition similar to the 1991 Gulf War model. There are also rumors, though not confirmed, that Swiss and Omani intermediaries have been approached to reopen back-channel communications between Tehran and Washington. If that's true, that would suggest both sides are seeking off-ramps. So we could probably expect the following diplomatic pressure points over the next 72 hours. Russia and China may attempt to push a UN General Assembly resolution condemning the strike, but it won't carry enforcement weight, and it could shape public opinion. The EU3, which is UK, France, and Germany, may attempt to restart a JCPOA 2.0 dialogue. But whether Iran has any interest in that after last night is highly doubtful. Gulf Arab states like Qatar and Oman may serve as neutral conveners. Qatar, in particular, has influenced both Washington and Tehran. Let's not forget the cyber domain. In the past, both the U.S. and Iran have demonstrated offensive cyber capabilities. After the Stuxnet incident
Stuxnet, that was awesome.
And subsequent Iranian retaliatory cyber campaigns like the Shamoon virus and distributed denial of service attacks on U.S. banks, we know this is a threat of engagement on both sides that are willing to enter into. The CISA, or the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, issued a bulletin this morning warning of potential Iranian cyber retaliation targeting U.S. critical infrastructure, including energy and utility grids, financial services, maritime shipping networks, and government websites and communication platforms. Major U.S. firms have already begun increasing firewall protocols and endpoint monitoring, especially in the defense and aerospace sectors. While there's no specific intelligence on an immediate or on an imminent Iranian cyber strike, officials are preparing under the assumption that retaliation may include non-attributable or deniable actions designed to send a message without triggering Article 5 type responses.
Oh, yeah, that's right. If they were to attack the United States directly as a NATO member, all the NATO members would be compelled to respond.
And that would be a formal declaration of war.
Yeah.
See, now we're getting back to...
Well, I remember when President George W. Bush said, hey, this attack on us is an act of war. We're going to ask the NATO members to activate as a result. But there wasn't a clear enemy. Like there wasn't a state responsible. So it became the war on terror. And so we have these authorizations for the use of military force against terrorists, you know? And so that it's weird.
And again, that's why it goes from being a war to a police action.
Right.
That's why we haven't had a war since World War II. So finally, we need to consider the domestic consequences, not just in Iran, but here in the U.S. And the president and supreme leader are already under internal pressure. Their failure to protect key nuclear assets could weaken regime credibility, or conversely, push them to escalate in order to project strength. Inside the U.S., the political divide is intensifying. Congressional hearings on the legality of the strike under the War Powers Resolution are already being scheduled. Expect questions on intelligence used to justify the operation, whether the administration bypassed Congress, and contingency planning for escalation in regional war. This will be a major political fight, not just about war powers, but about executive authority and national security. If escalation continues, we may see calls for a new authorization for use of military force. The first serious push for such legislation since the ISIS discussions a decade ago. So, what happens next? That depends on Iran's response, America's restraint, and whether diplomacy can function in the shadow of craters, missile plumes, and high-tempo military alerts. Here's what to watch. If Tehran launches a measured face-saving strike, like a symbolic missile barrage or cyber attack, it may signal a desire to de-escalate. If Tehran retaliates through proxies or high-casualty attacks, we could be heading towards regional conflict. And if Iran does nothing immediately, don't assume it's over. Strategic patience is a core tenet of Iranian doctrine. For the U.S. Navy and Joint Forces, the mission now shifts from kinetic dominance to operational endurance. Deterrence is no longer theoretical. It's active, live, and being tested in real time. The next 72 hours will tell us whether last night's operation was a clean surgical reset or the opening act in a wider conflict. Final thoughts, my friend?
Oh my gosh, I don't know if you're ready for all that. They're all confused and not able to be easily verbalized, but mostly because I don't have enough information. Like, I don't feel comfortable. This may come as a shock to you, but asserting an opinion on something with incomplete information on this, and I know some things, and I know I can see the logical leaps from one to the other and why we are where we are, but I mean, like you said, the biggest question is where do we go from here? And I
Yeah.
don't know. And I think there's only been one ceasefire that I've seen as successful, and that's tentatively the one between North and South Korea. Every other conflict has had to end with surrender, like some kind of unconditional surrender. And I don't know if that's what is being pushed for, or if it can just be like, hey, you guys, Iran, just don't make nuclear weapons and we're good. From a power perspective, that may be all. I don't know. I like I said, I'm still mulling the whole thing. It is brand new.
Yep.
We'll see. Maybe we'll have a follow up to this, depending on what unfolds next.
All right. So that's it for this episode of the U.S. Navy History Podcast. If you found today's breakdown helpful, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing with others. So until next time, stand by, stay informed, and as always, fair winds and following seas. Bye.
Bye bye.